According to my brother, you have been following the emigrants to Abyssinia and their encounter with the Negus. And at a certain point, about 30 of them returned back to Arabia. The question is, why did they return back? Because there was a rumor, probably spread by Amr ibn al-As, that there was a reconciliation between the Prophet Muhammad and the Quraysh. And so they went back, but unfortunately the rumor was not correct. And as soon as they set foot in Arabia, many of them were captured. Some of them could secure protection by some of their relatives in Mecca, but the others returned back to Abyssinia. This time not alone, but they took some more Muslims who also wanted to flee the persecution and went back to Abyssinia in what is called the second Abyssinian Hijra, the second immigration. The rumor that there was a reconciliation between the Prophet and the Kuffar is significant not as a rumor, but it was a basis of a secondary rumor that was invented much later on, about a century later, that said that this alleged reconciliation between Quraysh and Muhammad was because Muhammad yielded to the Quraysh a little bit and recognized their eyes. And this is the claim, that he was reciting the Quran, and when he came in Surah An-Najm to the place where it says أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى, did you ever consider the Lat, one of the goddesses, and the Al-Uzza, and one of the goddesses, and the Manat, the third goddess? And they claim that the Prophet introduced a phrase into the Quran that says these are the great goddesses and their intercession is to be sought. Of course, this is nonsense, because the immediate following part of the Quran is the Quran saying in a sarcastic way, these are have you ever considered the Lata and the Uzza and the Manat, the third goddess? أَلَكُمُ الذَّكَرُ وَلَهُ الْأُنْثَى, do you attribute the female progeny to God and you are proud of your male progeny? Because they thought that those goddesses were female and were the daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran immediately says this is not a fair distribution if you want to allege and relate daughters to Allah and you relate the boys selves. And the Quran says, إِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا أَسْمَاءٌ سَمَّيْتُمُوهَا أَنْتُمْ وَآبَاؤُكُمْ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ بِهَا مِنْ سُلْطَانٍ. These are just names that you invented, you and your fathers, without any authority from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you put that phrase inside, that these are the great goddesses, and try to secure their intercession with Allah, the continuity would be very conflicting. And of course, obviously this was a rumor. The man who said, if they put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand, I wouldn't change, I wouldn't accept, could not have yielded so much to idolatry. The occurrence historically of the emigration to Abyssinia produces some rules to us as Muslims. First of all is the acknowledgement of emigration as a way to flee oppression. And later the Quran will say those who die by the angels taking their lives while they were self-wronging by accepting oppression, and the angels asked them, where have you been? And they would say, we were oppressed in the land. And the angels would said, was the earth of Allah not spacious enough for you in order to emigrate? So emigration is one of the legitimate responses against oppression. Number two, that this immigration, it is okay and all right, Islamically acceptable, if you go to a Christian country, because Abyssinia was a Christian country at the time. So the schism is not that acute as some Muslims try to figure now, and it would be all right if you flee even to a Christian country. And I guess nowadays, at least amongst the Muslims, who are those who prefer to come to America rather than to face the oppression in their own Muslim countries. Number three is that the immigrants to Abyssinia must have been very active in da'wah. Because if you consider that their number was about 83 people, whereas right now today the population of Ethiopia is more than 50% Muslims. These Muslims could not have been the progeny of the some 80 people who were there and who later even left and came back. So these immigrants have been very active in da'wah, leading to a contemporary more than half of the population being Muslims in Ethiopia. And the Prophet, of course, was still in Mecca, and in spite of the oppression, he was always winning more people. And in some instances, it was enough for people just to listen to the Quran, and they become Muslims. As a matter of fact, it is reported that the three of the staunchest enemies of Islam, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira and two friends of his, who were very active at convincing people not to approach Muhammad, not to come near him, even putting cotton in the ears of people in order not to catch the Quran as the Prophet prayed. Some night he went to the house of the Prophet in order, he sneaked under darkness in order to turn to the Quran. And while coming back, he met his two friends that also sneaked in order to listen to the Quran. And these were the greatest kafirs. And they blamed one another, etc. But next night, they also went and found one another. And the third night, they also went and found one another. The response of the Quraysh was for the first time to visit the uncle of the Prophet, Abu Talib, but this time collectively, not individuals going, but they went as a delegation in Quraysh. And in their first visit, they complained to Abu Talib, the Prophet's uncle, that, well, your nephew is doing that and ridiculing our prophets and dividing us, etc. So can you leave him to us? It was one of the customs that if one of the Qurayshi that he is protecting someone, anyone, then the ethics was he would be protected. No one was to touch him. And Abu Talib, who was not a Muslim, although he was the Prophet's uncle, extended his protection upon Muhammad, and the Quraysh had to respect that. And this time they said, well, retract your protection and leave him to us. But of course, he refused. Then they visited him a second time, and they said, a threat this time. If you do not leave him to us, then we will fight both of you and we will fight you with him. Although he was one of them, one of the kuffars at the time. And Abu Talib called Muhammad and told him, you see, and they're saying that, and we are threatened. But that was the time the Prophet's response was Wallahi, if they put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left in order to leave this matter, I wouldn't do until it is either victory or death. And the response of Abu Talib, well, my nephew, go and say what you like, I'll never forsake you. And this, of course, led to the question, was Abu Talib a Muslim? There is evidence he was always protecting, and he was always defending in Muhammad's case, and had he accepted Islam, he would be useless in protecting Muhammad, because he wouldn't be one of them. And his protection would only be respected as long as he was one of them. If he were a Muslim, he would also be attacked, and the protection wouldn't do. And the third visit, collectively they went to Abu Talib and suggested to him, we are choosing one of our finest young people of Quraysh. The name was Maher Walid. And we are offering you an exchange. You take Maher ibn al-Walid, adopt him as a son, and you give us Muhammad instead. And he said, MashaAllah, you give me your son to feed him, and you take my son to kill him. And he dismissed them away. The idea of Quraysh after that was to hold an agreement, a treaty of boycott, sanctions. That they boycott all Bani Hashim, the branch of Quraysh to which the Prophet belonged. Not only the Muslims, but all Bani Hashim. And they were blockaded in the quarters of Mecca, that is called the Sha'b Bani Hashim. Until now in Mecca it is called the Sha'b, that is the quarters of Bani Hashim. Never to sell to them, never to buy to them, never to give them food, never to marry from them, etc., etc. And this was the beginning of the difficult period for the Prophet, the sanctions. It was very tough for the Prophet and the Bani Hashim in that time, and hunger and hungry children, etc. Although some of the reasonable people of Quraysh ventured to smuggle some provisions to them. And yet, the very happening of these sanctions was a bonus to Islam, because the other tribes across Arabia heard about it. So it brought Islam in focus to them again, and they sympathized with the Muslims being so blockaded, and some of them even came to inquire and accepted Islam. Until some of the Quraysh had their consciences moved by seeing own people and the flesh and the blood subjected to this treatment, and so voices started to rise, we should end this blockade, this is inhuman, these are not our Arab characters, etc. And at the time Abu Talib challenged them. He told them, my nephew tells me that the treaty you wrote about that, which you held inside the Kaaba, was destroyed and doesn't hold any of the specifications of the boycott. And he said, well, try, go and get it out of the Kaaba and see. And when they went, they found that the mole has eaten all in the page except for the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the end of the blockade. And after that, as the Quran reports, they told Muhammad, if you curse our idols, we will curse Allah. And in this, Quran was revealed, وَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. It was Allah's advice to Muhammad, do not curse their idols, because the result is that they would be cursing God, and you better avoid that. After the blockade, there was a rebound. They were set free. They were free again to go out and see people and being them. And some people came to Islam after seeing the Prophet and the Muslims. Not only individuals, but whole tribes, like the tribe of Daws, who accepted Islam and became Muslims. This was followed by what we call the year of grief, the year of sadness, when the Prophet ﷺ lost his uncle, who was his protector and his support, and lost his wife Khadija, who was his support from day one, and this was a great loss to him. Khadija died after 28 years of marriage to Muhammad ﷺ, during which she supported him and believed in him unconditionally and put herself and her abilities and her money in the service of the da'wah. And it was a sad period to the Prophet ﷺ, and it was a stepping up period for the Quraysh hurting Muhammad ﷺ. And we read about the incidences when he was praying at the Kaaba and they brought the bowl of a slain goat and put it on his head, until Fatima, his daughter, came and removed it. Abu Jahl vowing to go and put his foot on his neck while he was praying, but when he approached him, he was out and couldn't do it. And when also Abu Jahl promising to kill him with a stone, a large stone, and as he approached him while praying, he couldn't throw the stone at him. And when he went back, his friends told him what happened. You promised to kill him with the stone. He said, "Oh, didn't you see that great camel that's between me and him, the fierce camel that was about to kill me?" So that was the vision that prevented Abu Jahl from killing the Prophet ﷺ. Then the Prophet thought, well, I've done my best with Quraysh and the response is very limited. Maybe none of the Quraysh would respond to me more than the ones who already did. And so he entertained the idea of taking Islam out to the people. Very relevant, because to this very day, people abuse us and call us names when we go to give a lecture on Islam to non-Muslims, or go into churches or to colleges. How come you go to the Kafirs? Well, I hope they are not more religious than the Prophet ﷺ, but the Sunnah was established that take Islam out, reach out with Islam, and this was his journey to Taif. Taif is a beautiful city, excellent weather. I visited it, and it has many gardens and fruits, etc. And so he took his servant and the son, he was adoptee at the time, Zayd ibn Haritha, and went there. And he went to the notables of the city. And he told them about Islam, but they rejected him and ridiculed him. So he told them, well, at least keep it confidential, keep it a secret. He didn't want the Quraysh to know about this extra failure and be glad about it, but they said, no, we will announce it. And on his way back, they even stood in formation as two lines. As he walked in between them, they threw stones at him until he was hurt and he was bleeding. And then he took a little rest under the shade of an orange, not orange grove, this is where I live, a grape grove, and sat to rest. When a young man came to him and brought him grapes, and he felt very grateful. And as he took the first grape, he said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And the young man said, well, this is new. This is not said amongst the people in this city. Who are you? And the Prophet asked him, who are you? He said, I am called Addas. Where are you from? From Nineveh. And this, the Prophet said, this is the town of the virtuous servant Yunus ibn Matta, Yunus son of Matthew. And the man was amazed. How come you know him? And the Prophet said to him, he was a prophet and I am a prophet, so he's my brother. And at this encounter, Addas accepted Islam and became a Muslim. It was also in this very scene that the Prophet raised his famous supplication. اللهم إليك أشكو ضعف قوتي وقلة حيلتي وهوان ناس إلى من تكلني إلى غريب يتجهمني أم إلى عدو ملكته أمري أعوذ بنور وجهك الذي أشرقت له الظلمات وصلح عليه أمر الدنيا والآخرة أن يحل علي غضبك أو ينزل بي سخطك لك العتبى حتى ترضى إلا يكن بك سخط علي فلا أبالي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. This application is, O my Lord, please consider my weakness and my shortage of means, and the little regard people hold me in. You are the Lord of the oppressed and you are my Lord. To whom would you leave me, a stranger to insult me, or an enemy who dominates me? Would I that you have no wrath against me? Your pleasure alone is my objective. I take refuge under the light of your face, which illuminates all the darkness and on which this and the coming world depends. I pray you have no wrath upon me. To you alone belongs the right to blame and chastise until you are pleased. There is neither power nor strength except with you. And this is very emotional, very powerful prayer, and the Prophet admitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his feeling of misery and his feeling of loneliness and his feeling of oppression, etc. Yet he went back and the Quraysh yet stepped their aggression, and at this juncture Jibreel came to Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam and told him, I come with greetings from your Lord. And your Lord says, if it is your wish, I'll send the angel of the mountains to crumble the two mountains of Mecca upon their heads. And the Prophet said, no, I am hoping and praying that from these kafirs will come a progeny who would worship Allah alone. So although he was very sad, vengeance was not the answer, bitterness was not the answer, but he still could see beyond the oppression he was subjected to and hoped that from these Quraysh will be a progeny who will be Muslims, which happened later. We see that in the case of some other prophets, their people rejecting them were utterly destroyed. The people of Lut, the tribes of Ad, just cut off completely, but God's wisdom inspired the Prophet not to accept that the mountains would be crumbled over them, but he could see that through these kafirs will come humans, and this happened, alhamdulillah. Also in this journey, the jinn listened to the Quran, as reported by the Quran. قل أوحي إلي أنه استمع نفر من الجن فقالوا إنا سمعنا قرآنا عجبا يهدي إلى الرشد فآمنا به ولن نشرك بربنا أحدا. The Quran relates that a group of jinn listened to the Quran and they went back to their fellow and said to them, we have listened to very strange Quran. It guides to the best and we believed in him. and we will take no partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this established to us that there is another creation, another nation, that is the nation of the jinn, and that they are also are addressees of the mission of Islam, and some of them are, as the Quran tells us, some of them are good and some bad, just like people are. The consoling event that happened after that, after the humiliation and after the year of grief, was the journey of Isra and the Mi'raj. When the Prophet ﷺ, one night he was spending the night at the house of a cousin of his called Hani, and he prayed the Isha with them. And in the morning when he prayed Al-Fajr with them, he said, I have been through a journey. I went to Jerusalem, and then I went up in the universe. And he related to them his journey, as you must be well aware of it, and his encounter with the other prophets, and his stand amongst the other prophets by praying with them as their imam, and his mysterious, incomprehensible journey up there, things we cannot comprehend, but somehow he left the human sphere to another sphere that no human can ever venture into, not even Jibril himself. And the essence of this, well, some say it was to comfort him after the loss of his uncle and his wife. I don't believe this was the cause. I believe that the teacher to teach all humanity. For the first time there was a messenger sent by Allah to all humanity. All other messages were local. Local in time, local in people, local in place. But for the first time, this is a universal message, للعالمين. And it was quite a logic that the man who would educate all the humanity should be very well educated himself. And went on that journey to touch and to see the truth in relativism. We know the truth relatively. We know things by calling them names. If I don't have a name, you wouldn't know who I am. But all our knowledge as human beings depends on discovering things and attaching names for them. And things are very relative. When we drink milk, we know what milk is. But when the Quran says that in paradise you will be drinking milk, we know that the common here is the name. But the milk of paradise is not milk from a cow or a buffalo. It is something else conveyed to us through the language we speak, describing things that we see. But if the reality is told to us, we cannot perceive it. We are not able to comprehend the actual reality. But Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had the opportunity to face reality and get educated by it. And also at night, prayer was decreed. For the first time, it was in this journey that the first pillar of Islam, the prayers, were decreed. And you know the symbolic story, it is quite symbolic, that the Prophet went down and met Moses, and Moses knew that the prayers would be 50 times, and sent Muhammad back to plead for a lighter duty. It came down and came down till Allah told him, well, 5 times, and I'll give your people the reward of 50 times in prayer. Of course, when Muhammad told them that, Hind, his cousin, told him, please don't tell anyone. He said, Wallahi, I'm going to tell everyone. And he was so sure of himself, he was so careless about what people would say. And anyone in his position might be hesitant to tell this very strange thing to the people. And yet he told them. He told them about the journey. And the Kafirs were jubilant, because obviously Muhammad is coming now with a story no one would believe. And they said once he spreads that story, then even the Muslims would disperse from around him. And actually some of the Muslims apostatized, because it was so unreal, so impossible to believe that Muhammad, and in the span of one night, would go to Jerusalem and then in the higher universe and come back, etc., etc. But it was a litmus test in a way, because it could immediately differentiate between the mu'mins who are weak in their faith and the mu'mins who are powerful in their faith. And when the Kafirs went to Abu Bakr and told him, your friend say so and so, the story was very strange even to Abu Bakr. But having complete faith in the Prophet, he said, if he said so, then it is true. He kept his lines open. Perhaps they are a rumor that Muhammad didn't say. And therefore his expression was, if he said so, then it must be true. When he says Quran comes from high above with an angel, I believe him. How can I not believe him in anything he says? And that was the reason Sayyidina Abu Bakr was called the Siddiq, the believing Muhammad and believing in his truth. Following that, in Mecca, he continued offering himself to the tribes. The tribes came to Mecca seasonally every year, the pilgrimage season, which was also the commercial season, which was also the literary season, poets coming with their poems, etc., etc. And it was quite a crowd. And he offered himself to the tribe, would go to people, individuals and groups, in order to tell them about the... This was, of course, to the anger of the Quraysh. At this time, there was a fight between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. The Persians did not believe in God, worshipped fire, and the Romans were Christians. And it so happened that the Persians defeated the Christians. And, of course, the Kafirs were quite happy about it, because at least people who say there is God were defeated. But the Quran came to foretell, it might be one of the miracles of the Quran, that the Romans have been defeated in a near land, and after their defeat, they will have victory in the span of a few years. And Abu Bakr went to the Quraysh and told them that in less than 10 years, the Christians will defeat the Kafirs. This, of course, happened. Amongst the comers to Medina, to Mecca at the time, were people from Medina. And in Medina, the population was two main tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj. And these were perpetual enemies. Always wars amongst them. And the third inhabitant of Medina was the Jews. And so Medina was formed of three elements: the Jews, the Aus, the Khazraj. Least in number were the Jews. Majority Aus or Khazraj. And the Jews saw to it that their existence as a minority depends on the continuing battle between the Aus and the Khazraj. It is just like now. The main support to hegemony, the main support of Israel, is keeping the fight always ring between the Muslims. So that, as a matter of fact, it was not their power, it was our division that gave them power. And this was the scene in Medina. In that season where pilgrims came and the Prophet decided to go and meet them, were some individuals from amongst the Aus and the Khazraj. And in that very year, there was a bitter battle, military battle between the Aus and the Khazraj that was called the day of Bu'ath, Yawm Bu'ath, where so many of their notables were killed, so that both sides were quite sad at losing their dignitaries in battle. And so when Muhammad met them and told them about Islam, they were preconditioned. Maybe this is something that will unite us. Also, they were ridiculed by the Jews being people of the book. They believe in prophethood, they have the Torah with them, etc. And they always boasted over the Aus and the Khazraj who were kafir that we are people of God, we have scriptures, and we are waiting for a new prophet. A prophet is coming, probably from Arabia, and this will be completion to our chain of belief. And they made them feel that they were better people than them. And so the Aus and the Khazraj were already conditioned. They were sensitized. Would it be that this man is the promised prophet that the Jews are talking about? Would he be a man that would make peace instead of war between us? And they listened to him. And they were impressed. And they went back to Medina and told their citizens about what happened. The following season came a delegate of 12 people from the Aus and the Khazraj. And they listened to they accepted Islam, they believed in it, and they gave the Prophet a pledge. This time the pledge related to the Aqidah and the moralities of Islam. They gave the pledge: لا نشرك بالله شيئا ولا نسرق ولا نزني ولا نقتل أولادنا ولا نأتي ببهتان نفتريه بين أيدينا وأرجلنا ولا نعصيه في معروف. And this pledge, nothing about the use of power, nothing in military. The wording of this pledge that the 12 people gave the Prophet is very similar. As a matter of fact, it coincides with a later pledge that was called the Pledge of the Women, but that happened later on in Medina after the Hijra and when Islam was established in Medina. And the Pledge of the Women was almost the same wording. The Quran says, يا أيها النبي إذا جاءك المؤمنات يبايعنك على ألا يشركن بالله شيئا ولا يسرقن ولا يزنين ولا يقتلن أولادهن ولا يأتين ببهتان يفترينه بين أيديهن وأرجلهن ولا يعصينك في معروف فبايعهن واستغفر لهن الله إن الله غفور رحيم. Say, Prophet, if the women came to give you the pledge, then take the pledge that they would take no associates with God, they wouldn't steal, they wouldn't commit adultery, they wouldn't do an abomination, and they wouldn't kill their children, reference to abortion in a way, and they wouldn't disobey you when you order them to do something right. Then take their pledge and seek Allah's forgiveness for them. But this woman's pledge was a later version. It came in the Quran, and very interestingly, when the women later in Medina, of course, came to give the pledge to Muhammad, the form of the pledge was, of course, we pledge that. And at the time, the Prophet didn't shake hands with women. But was this the Prophet only, or is it a decree for all Muslims? Well, what happened is, they came to give the pledge. So the Prophet said, بايعهن يا عمر فإني لا أصافح النساء. Take their pledge, Umar, because I do not shake hands with people. And this means that the avoidance of shaking hands would apply only to the Prophet, because Umar ibn al-Khattab, upon the order of the Prophet, took the pledge of the women. And this was the the first pledge at the place called Aqaba, and it is called Bayat al-Aqaba al-Ula, the first pledge at Aqaba. And he sent with them a young man, quite young, called Mus'ab ibn Umair, in order to go with them to Medina and tell people about Islam. And the following season, this time a larger delegation came, and there were 73 men and 2 women from amongst the Aus and the Khazraj, and they came in order also to give the pledge to the Prophet Muhammad and to accept Islam and to await his instructions. And this time the Prophet probably was considering and entertaining the idea of emigrating to Medina, where he already has a base there, a welcoming base, a hostile milieu, as the case was in Mecca. And therefore, the pledge became a little different. It included such a thing as, you hear and you obey, in thick and thin, in tough and easy, and you protect me from whatever you protect your own selves and women and the children from. And this meant it was a defense pact this time. And this was very serious, because his uncle Al-Abbas was in Mecca, not Abu Talib, because Abu Talib died. And Al-Abbas, although not accepted Islam yet, told them, well, here someone like me, although not Muslim, can extend our protection on him. But he goes to you. Are you going to really protect him? Make sure of your word and of your promise. Or else, if you don't intend to fulfill, leave him in Mecca. And they said, no, we are solid about our promise. One of them, in order also to confirm, said, you people, do you really know what it means to give your pledge to this man? It means that everyone will fight you and you will fight everyone. Are you ready for that? And they said, yes, we are ready. And one of them asked, you know, we live with the Jews. They have their edge upon us. Is it your intention to come to us and then leave us to go to your people, leaving us to the Jews? And the Prophet said, بَلِ الدَّمَ الدَّمْ وَالْهَدْمَ الْهَدْمِ. You fight, I fight with you. You war, I war with you. I am from you, and you are from me, and I'll never leave you. Upon which they gave their military pledge this time, and this was the prelude of preparing to the Hijra to Medina. And then the Prophet instructed his followers to emigrate to Medina, because they already had a base there and friends and fellow believers. And they usually fled in secrecy, because the Quraysh would prevent people from fleeing to. And therefore they went in secret, except for one person, Umar ibn al-Khattab. He announced, I'm going to Medina. Whoever wants his wife to be widowed or his children to be orphaned, just as he said when he accepted Islam. And he went in daylight. The Abu Bakr wanted also to go to Medina, and every time he seeks the Prophet would say, just wait. Maybe Allah would provide you with a companion with you. But he didn't tell him, I'm going with you. And so Abu Bakr waited in Mecca, and the Hijra was the outcome of careful preparation. Some people think that because the Prophet was the Prophet, then he had to do nothing and Allah will take care of everything. No, that wouldn't be a prophet of Allah. The Prophet is the best to do their best in fulfilling the cause of Allah. Nothing comes easy. The Hijra was very carefully planned. Meanwhile, Quraysh came to the conclusion that the best way to deal with that man, and seeing that Islam leaked out of Mecca and went to Medina, maybe sometime in the future go to Medina and come back to us. So they thought the best thing is to kill the man. Oh, but kill, and Bani Hashim would take revenge, and etc. And they said, well, we will get a young man from every tribe, and they go and kill him in one strike, and therefore it will be divided between all the tribes, and all Bani Hashim can do is to take the ransom, and that will be the end of it. Some of the bad things Quraysh did. A woman called Salama and her husband Abu Salama and their child were migrating on their camel, and the prophets came and said, no, we are the uncles of this child. And they kept the child and the mother and allowed Abu Salama to travel only. And this was quite really to separate a family like that. And later on she could join her husband there. But it was in spite of the very high measures that the Quraysh took. Muslims went to Ethiopia until it was time for the Prophet himself to go. And this happened to coincide with the same night that the Quraysh intended to undertake their plot to kill the Prophet. And the Hijra was a top secret, of course, entrusted only to a handful of people, including two young ladies. It just gives you some insight upon the status of women in Islam. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, knew about it because he was to stay in Mecca, to sleep in the Prophet's bed, and stay on to the trusts that were entrusted to the Prophet to their legitimate owners. And of course Abu Bakr knew, and Abu Bakr's sons knew, his two daughters knew, and the guide of the journey knew, and that was all. Nobody knew except that. And when it was the time, the young people came and surrounded the house of the Prophet, but he managed to go out, and Allah made them not see him. And all the time they were peeping and seeing somebody in the bed, and they were under the impression that the Prophet was still in his bed, whereas it was Ali ibn Abi Talib who was in the bed. Very brilliant, because Ali ibn Abi Talib, it means that Ali ibn Abi Talib was willing to sacrifice his own life for that. He put his neck out. And then he went to Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr had already bought 2 camels and left them with the guide of the journey. And the Prophet and Abu Bakr went under dark, not in the direction of Medina, but in the opposite direction. They went south until they came to the cave, which is called the cave of Thawr, Gharu Thawr. And they took shelter in that cave. During that period, Asma would bring provisions to them. Asma is the daughter of Abu Bakr. And when it was the time for them to depart and wanted to mount the provisions on the camel, they were short of rope. And so Asma took her robe, split it in halves, and gave them the half of it in order to ligate make a knot for the provisions. That was why the nickname of Asma became Dhatun Nitaqain, the woman with the 2 half robes. And Ibn Abu Bakr Abdullah would come to them with the news. What are the Quraysh saying in Mecca? And he already told them that the Quraysh offered a reward of 100 she-camels for whoever can bring Muhammad and Abu Bakr, alive or dead. One of the servants of Abu Bakr, called Fuhayrah ibn Amir, would shepherd his sheep until near the cave, so that the footsteps of the son of Abu Bakr and the footsteps of Asma bringing the food, etc., would be erased out by the hoofs of the sheep. And after 3 days it was time to leave, and the Quraysh slowed down their hunt after really a near miss, because they went up to the cave and they didn't look into it. If they looked into it, they would have seen the Prophet and his companion, Abu Bakr. But they didn't. And some history books relate that this was supported by finding a spider web over the mouth of the cave, and a pigeon 2 eggs in a nest, etc. So they said this must have been since a long time, and they couldn't be there. And then their guide to the trip came to them with the 3 camels, his own and the 2 that Abu Bakr had bought. Who was that guide to the trip? He was called Abdullah ibn Urayqat. He was not a Muslim. And this means that you seek a service from him you think will be the best to do it. Not the best of knowing the map of the road, but also in keeping a secret. And this is again a sunnah. It is one of the things the Prophet did. There were many Muslims at the time, but he chose the one, if I get ill and have to undergo an operation, I would go to the best, Muslim or non-Muslim. I go to the best to do the job. So Abdullah ibn Urayqat took them along the journey to Medina, and he went through a very unorthodox route in order not to be followed. Yet a rumor spread in Mecca that 3 mounted people were seen in the desert. And the chap said it must be Muhammad and Abu Bakr. And so he well armed himself, took his horse and went after them. And as he approached them, the legs of the horse would sink into the sand. And getting it up, and again the legs of the horse would sink into the sand until he was very near them. And he asked, well, anshudukum Allah, I gave you my promise not to harm you. But I came because Quraysh offered 100 she-camels for whoever can get you. And the Prophet said, Allah promises you better than that. Suraqa, the name of the man was Suraqa. And Suraqa said, what does God promise me? And he said, God promises you that someday the bracelets of Kisra, the king of Persia, you will wear in your own hands. And the Suraqa accepted Islam, went back to Mecca. The people know it was not Muhammad that was there. Approaching Medina, their provisions were exhausted. They felt very hungry and thirsty. They found a little tent, and went to a woman there who was called Ma'bad, the mother of Ma'bad. And there was a little withering marasmic goat, and they would, can you have something to eat or drink? And she said, no, this goat doesn't yield any milk. And the Prophet took the udder of the goat and read Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and milked the goat, and it gave milk. He gave the lady to drink, she drank. He gave Abu Bakr, he gave Abdullah ibn Urayqat, he drank, and he filled the container and gave it to the woman. And when her husband came back, she told him, and he told her, this must be Akhu Quraysh, the brother of Quraysh, meaning Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Meanwhile, the Qurayshi people, of course, the Quran relates to the Hijra in many places. One of them, وَإِذْ يَمْكُرُ بِكَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لِيُثْبِتُوكَ أَوْ يَقْتُلُوكَ أَوْ يُخْرِجُوكَ وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ إِلَّا تَنْصُرُوهُ فَقَدْ نَصَرَهُ اللَّهُ إذ أخرجه الذين كفروا ثاني اثنين إذ هما في الغار إذ يقول لصاحبه لا تحزن إن الله معنا فأنزل الله سكينته عليه وأيده بجنود لم تروها وجعل كلمة الذين كفروا السفلى وكلمة الله هي العليا. The Quran relates. Consider when the Kafirs budged him to go out, and they plotted in order to confine him so that he wouldn't emigrate, or to kill him, or to banish you where it will be safe for them. And they plot, and Allah plots. But Allah is the of all plotters. And even if people wouldn't come to his support, Allah will come to his support. When he went and he was with his companion in the cave, and he would console and comfort his companion, don't panic, Allah is with us. And Allah sent his sakina over them and supported him with hosts, soldiers that you couldn't see, relating to the prophets, and made the word of far the lowest, and the highest word is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he approached Medina to a place called Quba, where he established the first mosque in Islam, Masjid Quba, and then proceeded to Medina, where the people were already anxiously awaiting him. And they would wait and wait and wait until it was burning sun, and they would go back again. And on that day, a Jew told them, people of Medina, you has come. He could see him, and they all came out, and there was the marvelous reception. There was the Islamic first national anthem, طلع البدر علينا من ثنيات الوداع, and it is still relayed with the same tunes like sang in Medina by the Medinans at the time. And they received him. They didn't know which was which, Abu Bakr or the Prophet, until Abu Bakr took his garment in order to shade it. Then they knew that this is the Prophet, and they welcomed him and sang, etc. The camel went into Medina. Everyone wanted the Prophet, come to our quarters, come to our quarters, come, and everyone wanting to take the camel. But the Prophet said, no, leave her. She has her instructions in Ma'mura. Until she went and knelt down in a place that was owned by two orphans in the Medina, and the Prophet bought it, and this was the site of the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ of Medina. Of course, it was in a very simple form, made of wood and date leaves, etc., etc. But this was Masjid al-Medina. That Islam says that no mosques are to be journeyed to except Al-Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, the Masjid of the Prophet in Medina, and Al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Palestine. The meaning of the Hijra was that Islam was negative and theoretical until they went to Medina. Because part of Islam, on top of prayer and fasting and worshipping and have good moralities, etc., is managing a society, managing the world and its problems. And that is when the Quran came with laws and legal statements and arrangements, which this is Islam. And this was not tenable in Mecca. But the tree of Islam does not grow in the absence of freedom. As soon as they went to Medina, there was a Muslim nation, a Muslim leader, a Muslim constitution, a Muslim state that spread to be a Muslim empire. And this is the beauty of the Hijra. One final comment about the Hijra. Ask yourselves, why did you migrate to the United States? If your answer is, we aim to fulfill the American dream and to have a larger bank account and to live more comfortably, etc. If this is your ceiling, then this is no better than what goats and sheep do. They travel from the dry graze to the generous graze. And therefore you should come and be in Hijra. It is the Hijra from Mecca to Medina that the Prophet said, La hijrata ba'd al-fath. No further Hijra after the conquest of Mecca. But again the Prophet would say, Al-Hijra qadiyatun ila yawm al-qiyamah. Hijra is there until the day of judgment. So if you have come with the purpose that you have come to a place where Islam can be better lived or better served or better spread, then you should make it your task on top of whatever worldly legitimate riches that you are seeking. Your ultimate goal will be the spread of Islam and telling people about Islam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.